I knew something was wrong the moment his mother set the table. Not obviously wrong. Not the kind of wrong you could point to and explain. Just a feeling, the way a room can feel off before you understand why. She had placed a setting in front of everyone, his father, his younger brother, his brother's girlfriend, and then she had looked at me, smiled warmly, and handed me the basket of dinner rolls. "Would you mind passing these around, sweetheart?" I took the basket. I smiled back. I said, "Of course." That was the moment I understood what kind of evening this would be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That moment came after the drive, after the small town, after the front porch where his father had shaken my hand and said, "So you're the one Daniel keeps talking about." It came after all of that. Before it, I was just a woman standing in someone else's kitchen, holding a bottle of wine I had spent 20 minutes selecting, trying to make a good first impression on the people my boyfriend loved most. Daniel had never told them what I did for a living. Not really. That wasn't entirely his fault. I had never made it easy. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital, one of those narrow places with exposed brick and handwritten menus. He was sitting across from me at a shared table, reading a worn paperback, and he had laughed out loud at something on the page without seeming embarrassed about it. I liked that immediately. When he noticed me noticing him, he apologized for the noise. I told him not to. We talked for an hour before either of us thought to introduce ourselves. He told me he was an architect. I told him I worked in medicine. That was true. It was also, technically, an understatement of considerable proportion. I was 31 years old, and I was a cardiothoracic surgeon. Specifically, I was the youngest attending in the history of the cardiothoracic program at the hospital where I worked. A distinction that had been written up twice in medical journals and once in a regional magazine that ran a photo of me in scrubs with a headline I found embarrassing. I had done my undergraduate degree in 3 years. I had finished my residency ahead of schedule. I had published research that other people with twice my experience had cited in their own work. None of that was something I led with. In the operating room, my title walked in before I did. Nurses adjusted their posture. Residents chose their words more carefully. Attendings from other departments deferred to me on cases that crossed into my specialty. I had grown up watching my mother, a brilliant woman with a master's degree in economics, be talked over at dinner parties by men who worked in middle management. I had promised myself I would never make my title the first thing people knew about me. I wanted to be known as a person before I was known as a position. So I told people I worked in medicine. I told Daniel the same thing, and he had nodded and said that must be demanding, and asked what I did when I wasn't working. No one had ever asked me that so quickly before. We talked about books for the next 40 minutes. By the time we had been together for 8 months, it felt too late to suddenly clarify. Every time I had thought about saying it, "I'm not just a doctor, Daniel, I'm a surgeon. Actually, I'm the department's lead cardiothoracic," attending the moment had slid past. He knew I kept long hours. He knew I missed dinners sometimes because of emergencies. He knew I took calls in the middle of the night, and that I couldn't always explain why. He assumed I was a general practitioner, maybe an internist. I let him assume. When he invited me to meet his parents, I said yes without hesitating. His family lived in a small city about 3 hours north. The kind of place where the same families had owned the same businesses for 2 generations, and everybody's kids had gone to school together. His father had run a hardware store for 30 years. His mother taught piano lessons out of the house. His younger brother, Caleb, had just bought a home nearby. The family had deep roots there, the kind that go down so far you stop questioning them. Daniel described his parents as warm but traditional. I heard that and understood it. I had grown up around people who measured worth in familiar ways: what you did, where you went to school, whether you owned property. I wasn't worried. I had navigated rooms like that before. What I hadn't anticipated was how clarifying it would be. The house was a 2-story colonial with a covered porch and a garden that had clearly been tended with patience over many years. His mother met us at the door in an apron, genuinely happy to see her son, and she hugged me after she hugged him, which I thought was a good sign. His father shook my hand firmly and said the drive must have been long and offered me something to drink before we even got inside. For the first 20 minutes, everything was easy. Then the questions started. Caleb's girlfriend, a woman named Megan who sold insurance and had the cheerful confidence of someone completely comfortable in this room, asked me how Daniel and I had met. I told the coffee shop story. Everyone smiled. Then his father asked pleasantly what I did. "Medicine?" I said. He nodded. Like a nurse? I work with doctors, I said. Which was also technically true. His mother looked relieved in a way I hadn't expected. That's wonderful, she said. Stable work, benefits. She said it the way someone says something they've been hoping to confirm. Dinner was served shortly after. That was when his mother handed me the bread basket. I passed it around. I sat back down. His father resumed the conversation he had been having with Caleb about property taxes, and his mother began telling Megan about a piano student who had just placed at a regional competition. Daniel was talking about a project at his firm. I ate quietly and observed. No one asked me anything else for a while. When the conversation eventually came back to me, it was his father who started it. He had a way of asking questions that sounded like they were already answered. The question was just a formality. So is the hospital close to where you two are living now? About 15 minutes, I said. Good commute, he said approvingly. Long shifts though, I'd imagine, even for the support staff. I looked at him. Support staff. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The hours are long, I agreed. His mother jumped in thoughtfully. Daniel mentioned you work a lot of evenings. That must be hard, especially thinking about, well. She paused with the delicacy of someone who had rehearsed the pause. The future. Family. There it was. I set my glass down. I love my work, I said simply. She smiled in a way that meant she had heard that before and was not particularly convinced by it. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Caleb and Megan sat close together on the love seat, and his father settled into the armchair that was clearly his. Daniel sat beside me on the couch, close enough that our knees touched. I was glad for that. His father talked about Caleb's new house, good investment, solid neighborhood, the right time to buy. His mother asked Megan about her firm, and Megan talked about her caseload with the easy fluency of someone who liked her job and wasn't self-conscious about it. Daniel talked about the building his firm was designing. Everyone had a clear, nameable thing they did, and the room assembled itself comfortably around those things. I had given them too little to work with, and in the absence of information they had filled in the shape of me themselves. Support staff, benefits, evening shifts, a girlfriend who worked somewhere near a hospital and would presumably need to reconsider that once children entered the picture. At one point, Caleb's father looked at me with genuine friendliness and said, "It's a good thing you found Daniel. Architects do well for themselves." He said it like a compliment, like he was telling me something useful. I smiled. I said, "He's very talented." Daniel squeezed my hand. He had no idea. The moment everything shifted came after dessert, which was a peach cobbler his mother had made from scratch, and which was genuinely excellent. We were standing in the kitchen while she wrapped up the leftovers, and his father was telling a story about a customer at the hardware store, and Caleb was laughing, and I had stepped slightly to the side to check my phone, a reflex, because I was always waiting for the hospital to need me. There was a message from a colleague, a patient I had operated on 2 days earlier, a 53-year-old man with a mitral valve that had been failing quietly for years, had been asking for me. He was recovering well and wanted to say thank you before discharge. My colleague had sent a photo the patient had asked to take him sitting up in the hospital bed, his daughter beside him, holding a handwritten card that said, "Thank you, Dr. Reeves, for giving me more time." I looked at the photo for a moment. When I looked up, Daniel's mother was watching me from across the kitchen. She had a look on her face I couldn't immediately read. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "A patient wanted to pass along a message." She tilted her head. "Your doctor?" "No," I said, "my patient." The room went quiet in a way that rooms do when everyone in them has heard the same thing and is processing it at slightly different speeds. His father turned from the sink where he had been rinsing a glass. He looked at me with an expression that was caught between confusion and the beginning of a recalibration. "You're a doctor?" "Yes," I said. "What kind of doctor?" I had answered this question thousands of times. I answered it the same way I always did, without performance, without drama. "Cardiothoracic surgery," I said. "I operate on the heart and lungs." No one spoke for a full 7 or 8 seconds. Caleb's girlfriend said, slowly, "Wait, like a surgeon?" "Yes." His father put the glass down on the counter. He didn't do it dramatically. He just set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who needed a moment to do something with his hands. Then he looked at Daniel. You didn't tell us she was a surgeon. Daniel blinked. She said she worked in medicine. I did, I confirmed. His mother's hands had gone still over the leftover cobbler. She was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I had seen it before. In hospital hallways, in waiting rooms, in conference rooms when I was introduced to someone who had formed a picture of me before I arrived. The expression of a person quietly revising. How long have you been his father started? 7 years since I completed my residency, I said. I've been the lead attending in my department for 2, Caleb said under his breath. Wow. His mother recovered first. She was the kind of woman who recovered quickly. Well, she said, with a warmth that was real but also slightly different from the warmth that had been in the room 20 minutes earlier. We had no idea. Daniel, why didn't you say something? Daniel was quiet for a moment. I didn't want to, he stopped. He looked at me, and his expression was complicated in a way I couldn't fully decode in that moment. Surprise, yes, but something else. We stayed another hour. In that hour, the room rearranged itself. His father pulled out a chair for me when I went to sit back down, something he had not done earlier in the evening. His mother brought out a different set of cups for the after-dinner coffee, the china ones, I noticed, not the ceramic mugs that had been on the table before. Caleb asked me 3 questions about cardiac surgery with the focused interest of someone who had just learned they were sitting next to someone interesting. Megan was quiet in a way that was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. His father asked about my training. His mother asked about my hours. Both of them asked good questions. Real questions. Questions that assumed I had something worth knowing. 20 minutes earlier, no one had asked me anything. I answered everything carefully. I was not cold. I was not sharp. I had spent enough time in operating rooms to know that nothing useful came from making people feel small when they were already off balance. But I noticed everything. The new cups. The pulled-out chair. The shift in how his father held his posture, slightly more upright now. The way his mother said of course before I had finished a sentence, as if she was being careful not to seem like she had ever underestimated me. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet for a long time. You should have told me, he said finally. You never asked what kind of doctor, I said. You know what I mean. I know, I said, but I wanted to see. He looked at the road. See what? I looked out the passenger window at the dark passing landscape. I wanted to see who you were when you thought you were with someone ordinary. He didn't answer for a moment. And? You were kind, I said. That mattered. He nodded slowly. But I could tell he was still somewhere inside his own thoughts, working through something he hadn't finished yet. The next morning he left for work early. He kissed my cheek at the door, the same as always. But there was something slightly more careful in it. Not distant, just careful. Like he was moving through a room he thought he knew, and had just noticed new furniture. I stayed home, drank my coffee at the kitchen table, and let the dinner replay itself in pieces. It wasn't anger that I felt. I had expected something like what had happened. I had spent enough years moving through rooms where people assumed things about me to know the shape of it, the particular texture of polite condescension, the way it feels like weather rather than intention. His parents weren't unkind people. They were people who sorted the world into categories they understood, and I had given them just enough information to sort me into a familiar one. What I hadn't anticipated was how clearly that would answer something I hadn't known I was still asking. 3 days later, Daniel's mother called me. Not Daniel, me. She asked if I'd like to have lunch, just the 2 of us, when we were next in their area. She said she hoped I hadn't taken anything from the dinner the wrong way. She said she thought it would be nice to get to know each other better. I said I'd like that. Lunch was at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a menu without pictures. She was there when I arrived, and she stood up when I came in, which she hadn't done at her own dinner table. She was trying. I could see that plainly, and I respected it. We ordered. We talked about Daniel, about the architecture firm, about her piano students. She asked me how I had decided on surgery. I told her honestly a summer in high school volunteering at a hospital, watching a cardiac surgeon work and understanding in my body that this was what I was meant to do. She listened with the attentiveness of someone taking notes. At some point she said, carefully, I hope you know we think the world of Daniel. I do know that, I said. And we want what's best for him. She paused. For both of you. I looked at her over my water glass. What does that mean to you? She seemed slightly surprised by the directness. I suppose someone who supports him, who builds a life with him. I plan to, I said. Of course. She smoothed her napkin. It's just your career must be very demanding. It is, I agreed. And you're so accomplished. She said the word gently, as if it might land badly. I suppose I wonder sometimes how that works. For both people. I understood what she was asking. She had been asking a version of it at dinner, when she had suggested I might need to reconsider my work after starting a family. She was asking whether I was the kind of woman her son could build a life next to, or whether my life would eventually become something too large for him to stand beside comfortably. I thought about how to answer. I think, I said slowly, that the right relationship doesn't require anyone to make themselves smaller. It requires both people to be big enough for each other. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. That's well put, she said. But her eyes had moved slightly, the way eyes do when a sentence lands somewhere unexpected. We finished lunch pleasantly. She hugged me outside the restaurant. She said we should do it again. I believed she meant it. On the drive back, I found myself thinking about something a mentor of mine had said during my residency, an older woman who had been one of the first female cardiothoracic surgeons at her institution. She had told me once that the hardest thing about being underestimated was not the initial assumption. The hardest thing was what came after, when people overcorrected, when they became so careful, so demonstratively respectful, that the attention itself became another way of making you aware that you were different, that you existed in their minds as a category rather than a person. I was starting to understand what she meant. The following weekend, Daniel and I had dinner together at our apartment. He had cooked, something he did when he was working something out. Pasta, simple, the kind he could make without thinking too hard. We sat across from each other, and halfway through the meal, he put his fork down and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you said you wanted to see who I was when I thought I was with someone ordinary," he paused. "What were you actually testing?" I looked at him. "I wasn't testing you. It felt like a test." "It was an observation," I said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" I thought about it. A test has a pass or fail. An observation just tells you something. He nodded slowly. "And what did it tell you?" "That you're a good man," I said. "And that you were raised by people who taught you to sort the world in a specific way. And that you didn't notice you were doing it." He looked down at his plate. "I didn't know who you were." "You knew who I was," I said. "You didn't know my title." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," I said. "A very important one." He stayed with that for a while. What I didn't say, what I was still figuring out how to say, was that the part that had stayed with me from dinner wasn't his parents. It was him. The way he had smiled and said nothing when his father made the support staff comment. The way he had kept talking about his own project while his mother implied I should reconsider my career for the sake of a future family. He hadn't meant anything by it. I understood that. He had grown up in a room where that silence was normal, where you didn't interrupt your parents' assumptions. But silence is still a choice, and comfort is a place you can choose to leave. A few weeks later, Daniel asked me to come back with him for his father's birthday. I went. Dinner this time was different in ways both visible and invisible. His mother had clearly told his father more about what I did, because his father asked me, before we had even sat down, about a news story he had seen regarding a new surgical technique. He had clipped it from a physical newspaper. He handed it to me across the kitchen counter. "Thought you might find this interesting," he said. I did find it interesting. I told him so genuinely, and we talked about it for 10 minutes, and he listened with real attention and asked follow-up questions that showed he had read the article carefully. There was something touching about the effort behind it. The clipping, the preparation, the desire to meet me somewhere. At dinner, his mother asked about my patients not in a specific way. She understood privacy, but in the way you ask someone about work that matters. She asked if it was difficult, carrying that kind of responsibility. I told her sometimes it was, and sometimes it was the most clarifying thing I knew how to do, and she nodded like she understood both of those things. His father called me Dr. Reeves twice before I asked him to please use my first name. "Claire," I said, "just Claire tonight." He smiled and looked slightly relieved. "Claire," he said, like he was testing how it fit. Caleb was there again, and Megan, and at one point Caleb said, "To the table generally, I've been telling everyone my brother's girlfriend is a heart surgeon. It's a great icebreaker." The table laughed. I laughed too. But I also noticed something. He said my brother's girlfriend is a heart surgeon. Not Daniel's girlfriend Claire, who happens to be a surgeon. The noun had shifted. I had become, in his telling, a label attached to a relationship. Still useful to him, still interesting, still something that reflected well on the family by proximity. But I was the adjective now, not the subject. I didn't say anything. I filed it away. Later, Daniel and I sat on the back porch while his parents finished up inside. The night was cool and clear, the kind of night that makes a small town feel like it has gravity, like it would hold you if you let it. "You seem different," Daniel said. "Different how?" He thought about it. "Quieter." "I'm observing," I said. He turned to look at me. "What do you see?" I looked at the backyard, the garden his mother had built over years, the old oak tree at the far edge of the property, the lights in the kitchen window where I could see his parents moving around, passing each other things, the choreography of two people who had shared a kitchen for a very long time. "I see people who love you," I said. "And I see people who are trying. Is that enough?" I didn't answer right away. "I think it depends on what they're trying to do," I said finally. "If they're trying to know me, yes. If they're trying to earn me, that's different." He frowned slightly. "What's the difference?" "Knowing someone starts with curiosity," I said. "Earning someone starts with debt." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think they feel like they owe you something, because of how dinner went the first time." "I know," I said, "and that's not a foundation. That's an apology that never ends." The stars were out. A dog barked somewhere down the street. "Do you still want this?" Daniel said. He said it carefully, not with fear exactly, but with the seriousness of someone asking a real question. I looked at him. "Yes," I said, "but I need you to understand something. Tell me, when your father made that comment about support staff, I need you to be the kind of person who says something, not to correct him for my sake. Because you know me, and you don't let someone misrepresent someone you love." He was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't know then," he said. "I know," I said, "but you know now." He looked at his hands. "I hear you." Something about the way he said it, not defensive, not reassuring, just present, made me feel, for the first time in weeks, that we might actually get there. The month that followed was the most honest one of our relationship. Daniel started asking me questions he had never asked before, not about my credentials or my publications or the cases that made the news, but about the specific texture of the work, what a surgery felt like from start to finish, what I thought about in the hours before a difficult operation, what it was like to lose a patient and then walk into the next room and do it all over again. He asked about the first surgery I had ever assisted with, as a medical student, and whether I had been afraid. I told him yes, terrified, and also more certain than I had ever been of anything. He told me he had been going to therapy for the past few weeks. Not because anything was wrong, he said, but because he had realized something after the first dinner. He had realized he had been raised to see success as a competition, and that he had never examined what that did to how he saw the people he loved. I told him I thought that was one of the bravest things he had said to me. He said, "I don't want to be someone who needed to know your title to see your worth." I looked at him. "You weren't," I said. "You saw me in a bookstore and wanted to know what I was reading. That's not someone who sorts people by category." He smiled. "A real one." "Okay," he said, "but I want to do better." "So do I said. His mother called me the following Tuesday, not to invite me to an event or ask a carefully worded question. She called to tell me she had been thinking about something I said at lunch about both people needing to be big enough for each other, and that it had stayed with her. She said she realized she had walked into that first dinner with a story already written, and that she was sorry for that. I told her I appreciated her saying so. She asked if I might teach her something about the heart sometime. Not medically, she laughed a little at that, but just what it was like to work with one. To hold something that fragile and that strong in your hands. I told her I would think about how to describe it. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I wrote her a letter. 2 pages, handwritten. The way she had written the note that had come with the silk scarf she sent, which I had eventually taken out of the drawer, not because I forgot what it represented, but because it was a beautiful scarf and she had chosen it carefully. In the letter I tried to explain what it felt like to stand over a still heart, and know that your hands were the reason it would beat again. I tried to explain the weight of that, and also the privilege. She called after she read it and didn't say much at first. Then she said, "I think I understand now why you couldn't let anyone know what you were until you knew who they were." I said, "Yes." There was a pause, and then she said, I'm glad you chose my son. So am I said. Daniel proposed again 6 months later. Not again, exactly he had never officially asked before. We had simply moved in the direction of it. But this time he asked properly, in the apartment, on an ordinary Tuesday. No setup, no candles, just the kitchen table and 2 cups of coffee going cold. He said, I don't want to be with you because of what you are. I want to be with you because of who you are. And I'm finally sure enough of the difference to ask. I said yes. At the engagement dinner, small, family only, his father stood up and said something that surprised me. He said he had spent his whole life believing that a man's job was to provide for the people he loved, and that he was proud of that. But that he had recently learned there were other things to provide: presence, honesty, the willingness to be wrong. He looked at Daniel when he said it, and then he looked at me. He said he was glad his son had found someone who knew the difference. I looked down at the table for a moment. I thought about everything that had led to that room: the bread basket, the china cups, the clipped newspaper article, the letter I had written, the 2 pages about the heart. People don't reveal who they are in the moments when they know who you are. They reveal who they are in the moments before, in the small decisions, the small assumptions, the thing they hand you instead of placing in front of you. That is where character actually lives. The best thing I ever did was walk into a room without my title and pay attention. Not because I wanted to catch anyone failing, because I needed to know who they were when they thought they had nothing to gain from knowing me. That is the only test worth giving, and it is the only result worth building a life on. If any part of this story made you look differently at the way you treat the people around you, the ones whose titles you don't yet know, whose stories you haven't heard, I think that's the thing worth carrying with you. Because someday, you will be the one walking into a room as nobody, and what the people in that room do next will tell you everything you need to know.